we are thrilled, absolutely thrilled, to be welcoming former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch to our school and to our University of Pittsburgh today. As a school that's focused on preparing the next generation of public service leaders, prepared to work at home, prepared to work abroad, Ambassador Yovanovitch offers all of us an inspiration for a life that's in service to others, in advancing democracy, and as a model of a truly ethical leader. And I think we all saw that so clearly and continue to. For students and faculty in our school and at the university who are focused on learning and scholarship in international affairs, international development, and public administration, her work offers insights on global governance, on diplomacy, on politics and foreign affairs. For our alums who are joining us, who are working in the public sector, private, and also nonprofit sectors, she offers a career of impact that I think we can all aspire to. And to our broader communities who are joining us today, and really for all of us, I think Ambassador Yovanovitch offers us a very personal story in the context of incredible conflict, protest, changing governance, shifting politics, and really history being made around the world throughout her fantastic and impactful career. Marie Yovanovitch joins us today as a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and best-selling author of the memoir, Lessons from the Edge, a book in which she shares insights on the region and the current crises, as well as experiences from her 33-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service. Marie Yovanovitch served 3 times as a U.S. ambassador, most recently in Kyiv as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Previously, she served as U.S. ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic from 2005 to 2008 and the Republic of Armenia in 2008 through 2011. She retired from the Foreign Service in 2020 and is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a non-resident fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Born into a family that survived Soviet and Nazi terror before emigrating to the US, Yovanovitch rose to the top of her profession in the crucible of the former USSR. Following early appointments in Moscow, London, Ottawa, and Mogadishu, she served as Deputy Director of the Russia Desk and then as a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. She was named Deputy Chief in Ukraine. Within the Department of State, Ambassador Yovanovitch has worked on the Russia Desk, the Office of European Security Affairs, and the Operations Center. She also served as the Dean of the School of Language Studies at the Foreign Service Institute, the U.S. Department of State, and at the U.S. Department of State as the Deputy Commandant and International Advisor at the Dwight D. Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy at the National Defense University. Ambassador Yovanovitch earned the Senior Foreign Service Performance Award 8 times and the State Department's Superior Honor Award on 9 occasions. She's the recipient of 2 Presidential Distinguished Service Awards and the Secretary's Diplomacy and Human Rights Award. Following her retirement, Ambassador Yovanovitch received the Trainer Award for Excellence in the Conduct of Diplomacy from Georgetown University, the inaugural Richard G. Lugar Award from Indiana University, the 2020 Penn Benenson Courage Award from PEN America, and the Morgenthau Award from the Armenian Assembly of America. In early 2022, Marie Yovanovitch's memoir, Lessons from the Edge, and if you haven't read the book or received the book, please know that it was an instant New York Times bestseller and an absolutely fantastic and engaging and informative read. The late Madeleine Albright, who we all remember so fondly, called the book a brilliant, engaging, and inspiring memoir from one of America's wisest and most courageous diplomats. Essential reading for current policymakers, aspiring public servants, and anyone who cares about America's role in the world. And I suspect you all put yourselves in those categories. So with that, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch to the stage and to the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
For having me. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here with all of you.
I appreciate it. We're so excited to dive into conversation. I know there are many questions that are bubbling up, and you have a sense of how to share them, and we'll jump into some additional questions later on. But I want to get the conversation started. One, just by thanking you again personally for being here. We've had a wonderful day with you so far. We had a visit to the Ukrainian Nationality Room, which is this unique asset, the nationality rooms at the University of Pittsburgh, and just wonderful to be able to step into that space, connect with Ukrainian students, other leaders around the university who are doing work in that space and around issues of preserving culture and remaining connected around the world. We also had meetings with other colleagues and leaders from across the university. And there's a lot that we can explore related to your book and really your amazing career. So I'm hoping we can first talk just a bit about the book, then about the Foreign Service and its roles, its significance and impact in the world around us, and maybe what's ahead, and then dig in on some recent and current events. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
Good, great. All right. Well, clearly you had an extraordinary career in the Foreign Service with a culmination that was highly public and deeply politicized, probably to say the least. For many in this room who care about and pay attention to politics, governance, global issues, the testimony that you provided at the House Intelligence Committee in 2019 brought not only you as a person and as a public servant into focus, but also the work of all in the Foreign Service. And I think very pointedly the threats to the system of diplomatic relations and intelligence that we had seen persist for so long. And your book, Lessons from the Edge, offers so much to our understanding of these issues. I wonder, just generally, what's the story that you wanted to tell in this book about events that you've been involved with, your career in the Foreign Service, and then also just about you?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So after I testified in 2019, I got literally thousands of letters from Americans from all over the country. They said, thank you for your service, which I very much appreciated. They often told me a little bit about themselves, but many people said, we didn't know about the Foreign Service. We didn't know what the State Department does. Write a book, tell us more, and we want to hear about you too. So, it became clear to me that it was time to retire. There was no place for me at the State Department at that time. And so in January of 2020, I retired and didn't quite know what to do, but decided to sit down and write a book. And that was, I didn't quite realize what a challenge it would be. I'm not sure I would have embarked on that had I known. But what I wanted to do with the book was to answer those letters and tell people a little bit about my life. And so this is a memoir about my experiences in life, but also in the Foreign Service and diplomacy, anecdotes, throughout my 30 plus year career that I'm hoping will let people know what it's like to work at the State Department, what it means to be in the Foreign Service, why it's important to America. What we do is just as important as what the Department of Defense does, sending troops to front lines around the world to keep us safe, the intelligence community. The State Department is also on the front lines of keeping us safe, our security, our economy, and our political might around the world. And it's not only important to our country as a whole, it's really important to every single American. I mean, if you have a business that is reliant on some sort of exports or imports overseas, probably the US State Department, some Foreign Service officer in a faraway country has been negotiating, the tariffs or whatever it might be. If there's a diplomatic catastrophe that has been avoided, you probably aren't reading about it in the New York Times or anywhere else because it's been avoided, thankfully. But it's because of the daily work of Foreign Service officers and others in the national security sphere that are making sure that these budding problems don't become a major issue that then dominate our lives and the headlines. Secretary of State Schultz used to call this tending the garden. that, most diplomacy is not very glamorous. You are in there every day working with host country nationals to build bridges, to create common understandings, to sniff out if there are any emerging problems and try to solve them, or at least manage them so they don't become crises. And he likened it to a garden, because gardeners also every day have to go into that garden and cultivate the beautiful flowers, our allies, and snip back the evil weeds. I don't need to tell you who they are. and just generally take care of the garden every day so that it doesn't become an unmanageable jungle in several months. And I thought that was a pretty good analogy for diplomacy. And so it's what I tried to show in this book, that we often do unglamorous work, but very important work. And that, so often when we talk about foreign policy, we talk about it in black and white, but it's usually in shades of many, many grays. Often there are no great choices. There may not even be any good choices. And so how do you navigate all that? And I tried to share a little bit from my experiences about some of the complexity that we have to deal with in a dangerous world in order to keep the American people safe, prosperous, and free.
Thank you. How much of it is a story about you and your path?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is. And so, I don't make any claims that, my path is the path everybody else is going to follow to get into the Foreign Service or to manage their career and move on in the Foreign Service. I mean, one of the things that I learned relatively early on when I was at our embassy in Great Britain, I had the great fortune to be a staff assistant, a very junior position for the ambassador. And it was during our government's transition. So President Reagan was the president, then his ambassador that he had nominated, a political appointee left. There was a long-term chargé, somebody who's in charge, who was a career person, also a man, of course. And then there was another political appointee when the first George Bush appointed his ambassador. And these were three very different individuals. And what I learned from that experience, seeing them, first thing in the morning, last thing at night, doing all the little grunt errands that need to happen in order to keep things going. What I learned was that they were all very different. They did things in their own way, but they were effective. And that was like a little eureka moment for me, that I could manage my career in my own way. I didn't have to try because, all the role models were men at that time, or most of them were. I didn't have to try to be a little man and imagine myself, well, what would a man do in this position? What would a senior Foreign Service officer who would be male do in this position? I could think about, what do I feel comfortable doing to, get to where we need to be? And I think that was a really important lesson because it enabled me to be myself. And I think when you are comfortable in who you are, you can be much, much more effective because everybody is going to recognize that and you can move forward more easily.
I love that. That's great. There's so much that's powerful in the book and in the narrative. And I think one of the things that struck me in particular was the depth of the narrative in demonstrating what it's like to do this work. And you've already started to hit on that as you're describing some of these pieces, seeing people in the morning and definitely late into the night as you were doing this work. There are many places and events and people in the book that I think remind us of the extraordinary history that you lived and worked through in the time that you were in the Foreign Service. And I think you demonstrate so clearly what it feels like, the joys and the mundane, the unglamorous, as you said, and the fears in some cases, and really all of it. And it's really personal in a lot of ways. And I think it demonstrates the very human experience of doing this work. And I think for many who are considering careers in this space, and I think about our students, I think about early career alums who I am aware of, I think it can be difficult to imagine yourselves in this work. And I think might question their ability to do it. You assume that somehow these are sort of superheroes that are out there that are somehow different than you are, and that you might not be able to do it. And I wonder, What was the approach that you took in telling this story, and what do you want readers to take away from it? And especially early career folks who are thinking about, is this for me?
Yeah.
Can I actually do this? Can I be
Yeah.
Ambassador Yovanovitch someday?
Well, so what I tell people, because I get these questions a lot. I mean, what I tell people is that I had a great career, and not because I became ambassador. I had a great career because I enjoyed what I was doing. I was passionate about the work, not every single aspect about every single day by any means, because like every other field, there's a lot of just boring, bureaucratic, whatever stuff that you need to do. But I was interested, I was passionate about what I was doing. And I think that's what gets you through the day, through the month, through the years, and all of us spend so much time at work. And what I would hope for each one of you is that you are passionate about your future endeavors, because that is what is going to get you through the day. But more importantly, it's what's going to make you not only successful, but make you impactful. Because you want to be there and you are thinking hard about what to do and you are building teams and you are making a difference in people's lives. So, the Foreign Service is not for everybody. It's a very difficult life. You change your jobs every couple of years. Often you're changing what country you're living in every 2 to 3 years. And so even if you start, after a certain period of time, you start specializing a little bit more and you run into colleagues and are working with people, you're still proving yourself every time you're in a new job. And that is tremendously stressful. And, just imagine changing everything. And then if you're single, you're far, far away from all of your relatives and support system. And if you've got a family, you need to think about whether your spouse or partner is happy and employed, whether your kids are in good schools, all that settling in period. I mean, there are a lot of challenges to this line of work, but for those who kind of embrace it, it can be tremendously rewarding, So yeah, you're dragging 3 kids around the world, but I just got an email this morning from a couple that I had worked with in Bishkek. At that time they had no children. They now have 5 children. They are living in India, and every time they email me, they are taking all 5 kids, 14 years old down to 3, all over India. I mean, imagine what an impact that has on those kids. It's a pretty rich life in terms of the experiences that they are getting. Although, again, maybe it's not a life for every child, perhaps a child with special needs, perhaps a child who just doesn't adapt that well to that kind of change. And so I think the decision to join the Foreign Service, to continue in the Foreign Service, is very individual. But I would encourage everybody who's interested in foreign policy to give it a try, because it's just a great way to earn a living, to serve the American people, and to make a difference every day.
That's great. I remember in the book sort of going to the stresses of this job, lots of good things, lots of stresses as well. I remember in the book you said that Colin Powell gave you the advice to never let them see you sweat.
Yeah.
Is that good advice?
I think it is good advice. It's not advice I was very good at following. And, so I think he was one of those people who, it was pretty clear maybe he was sweating behind the curtain, but in front of the team, he certainly wasn't. I try to be calm and poised and everything else. And I think I usually manage that outside the embassy building, outside the State Department, when I was still employed. With the team, I mean, I put a lot of effort, I think all leaders do, in building the team, in trying to, hear from them what they're concerned about, what we should be doing next, where can I do better, all of those things. And that creates, a pretty tight kind of team and relationships. And they knew when I was concerned, and they knew when I was worried. And I would try really hard not to transmit it like a virus throughout the embassy, but certainly the the most senior people had an idea of when when things were most stressful. And that wasn't anything I needed to say. I mean, they just knew.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's great. I thinking back to the early years in your career in the Foreign Service, I think you probably made a choice that some might find surprising to take a first job in Mogadishu. Can you talk about some of the early career decisions and how they shaped your pathway, and what were really the intentions that you had? What was driving you? And I sensed in the book, you had this incredible, just a drive, of course, but also maybe a sense of awe and
Yeah.
just sort of wonder and willingness to learn and just dive in. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Well, I do think that being part of this business is, you should never lose your curiosity and your, that kind of pinch me feeling that, I'm actually really doing this. Because I felt, in many places around the world that I was doing the kind of work that I would pay somebody else to have that opportunity to do. And here I was, a Foreign Service officer. I was getting paid a salary to go out and meet people, collect information, analyze it, send it back to Washington, and provide policy recommendations. I mean, that was pretty cool for a relatively junior officer. And I found it really interesting and rewarding. And, I arrived in Moscow in 1993 as a very junior officer. And within a month, Yeltsin and the parliament had a very, very violent confrontation. And, things just never let up after that. And I would literally, when I woke up in the morning, I would literally lie in bed and go, I wonder what's going to happen today. Because I knew something was going to happen. And I knew that somehow I was going to have to, at a junior level, but that I was going to have to respond to some part of that. And it was exciting and it was important. And it was important to us in the United States. What is happening in Russia and how does that affect our interests? That was tremendously important at the time and continues to be, of course. So I did kind of have that feeling of, pinch me, is this really real? And I continued to have it. And I made myself a promise that when I lost that feeling, that I would leave the Foreign Service, because there's no point in dragging yourself around the world if you don't think this is pretty great, right? And fortunately for me, that feeling didn't leave.
That's good. I hope we can all have that. I know I have that occasionally.
All right.
For sure.
You heard it from the dean.
In the narrative in your book, and as I've sort of listened to you talk today as well, and some other conversations, I think you convey such compelling images of the places where you worked and where you lived, from beaches in Somalia that you had a chance to visit, to historic churches in Armenia, and many, many things in between. And I think you note in the prologue to the book as well that you felt so fortunate to have lived all around the world and experienced the diversity of many countries and many peoples. And you also note that it was your aim to convey the richness and the beauty of the cultures that you encountered. Can you share an example or two of how your efforts to learn deeply about the places where you were and explore the countries that you worked in helped inform your diplomatic work? How do those go hand in hand?
So I'll give you an example that may not be quite on point, but when I arrived in Mogadishu, that was my very, very first tour. It was 1986, and it was not the way you think of Somalia now, but it was a pretty basic country and a country at war. But the war was far away in the north, and you didn't really feel it in Mogadishu. And the first morning I arrived, I was woken up early in the morning by the sound of the Mezzouin, the Islamic call to prayer. And I had never I'd never heard that sound before, but I knew what it was. Instinctively, if you've read books, if you've read, so I had read about Somalia and prepared myself before I came. And so I knew what that was. And I thought it was such a beautiful and haunting and compelling call to prayer. And I know that there are some who do not feel the same way, especially at 5 o'clock in the morning. And what it reminded me of was my childhood. So I grew up in New England, in a very white bread community of 2,000 people that were mainly teachers at the schools, some factory workers and some farmers. And it was dotted with Episcopalian churches. And my parents taught at a private school, and there was an Episcopalian chapel there. And every morning and every afternoon and every evening, the bells in the bell tower would ring out, and again, calling people to prayer. And that's what it immediately reminded me of. And I think that when we look for ways for the commonalities between our cultures, rather than the differences, and there were obviously many different and important parts of the Somali culture, but there are also things that I could recognize, the importance of their culture, the importance of their religion, and the little reminder, which I never would have thought of before. I was lying in bed there listening to the Mezzanine, that we do share things in common. And I think that diplomacy, perhaps like most businesses, is about human relationships. I mean, we forget that when we look at the news, but it's about can we have a real conversation? Maybe not a trusting conversation or a positive conversation, but a real conversation about where we are with Russia, for example, or with China. And can we build on that? And you are, I as a diplomat, I think most people as diplomats, you're looking for all sorts of ways to create commonalities, to start building trust, start to keep that conversation moving forward in a positive way. And so I guess, that's how I would answer that question, that people recognize when you are being genuine, when you are trying hard, and when you're going kind of beyond your brief to to shepherd the conversation forward.
That was a perfect example. Thank you. That's great. Just a bit more about your career and sort of observations on the Foreign Service, your experiences, and I think especially how you've seen it change over time. When you started your career in the 1980s, and probably well beyond, there were obstacles for women who were in the Foreign Service. And you talk fairly early in the book about the Palmer case and the implications that it had for your career personally, and for women in the Foreign Service more broadly. And I think in one quote, you note, it's important to understand that sometimes persistence and hard work aren't enough. Sometimes we need an iconoclast, an Allison Palmer, willing to risk it all in the fight to make our institutions live up to our ideals. Can you share a little bit about the case for those who are unfamiliar, and then also how it shaped your experience and what you saw follow in decades at the Foreign Service?
So the Allison Palmer case was really a landmark, not just for women, but for everybody at the State Department. But it was not well received either by those who were running the State Department or by all of my many male bosses who perceived it as a threat, quite frankly. So Allison Palmer was a woman who I think came in the 1940s or the 1950s, and was routinely passed over for jobs and for promotions because, her male colleague needed that job more because that person had a family, et cetera, et cetera. And she sued on her own behalf, and she won. And then she took it one step further, and she started a class action lawsuit. Now, this is, decades before I joined the Foreign Service. And the State Department fought that class action lawsuit at every step of the way. And in 1992, an appellate court found that the State Department discriminated against women basically at every turn. They discriminated against women in how the exam was administered, in intake into the Foreign Service, in how they assigned you to specialties within the Foreign Service, and how they assigned you to jobs in the Foreign Service, and in promotions. So pretty much across the board, it was found that the State Department discriminated against women. But by that time, I joined in 1986. I mean, I had heard enough in the corridors of the State Department to understand that this was not well perceived by many in the State Department. People felt that it was women who couldn't get ahead in any other way. And so they were using the judicial system to get a leg up, and that this was discriminatory against the males in the department. And so I was approached by the personnel system as somebody who could possibly be considered under the class action lawsuit, because I had been put in the administrative cone rather than the political cone, so doing political work, which I had wanted. And it was found in this lawsuit that that was one of the common ways that women were discriminated against in the State Department. So they asked me if I wanted to be considered, and I said, yes, I did. And so I applied to be one of, I think it was 14 women who got this remedy, and I was selected. And so I got my first political assignment as a result. But because I could, the zeitgeist in the State Department was so negative about this lawsuit, I thought, I'm not going to tell anybody that I am a part of this lawsuit. And I didn't for years until I wrote this book, because I felt that, when you're writing a book, you start thinking about, what do you include, what don't you include? But I also felt, I had to share something like that because I thought it was so important and so much a part of my early years in the State Department, where I tried every which way to get into the political cone. Mentors tried to help me. Nothing worked. And then finally, this legal remedy helped me out. And what I have discovered since the book has been published is I've gone to events like this, and somebody will come up to me and say, I took the exam for the Foreign Service and I didn't pass the exam. And in 1992, I got a letter from the State Department saying that, I would be eligible for a remedy if I wanted to apply. Happened more than once. And women in the State Department have come up to me and said, I'm one of the women who also got a remedy and I didn't tell anybody. And another woman who I worked with for many years and is actually a friend. Now, I never told her, but what she told me is that she had decided, she was offered the remedy, but she decided because of the zeitgeist that she was not going to apply for this, and that she would get it in another way. And she said, I regret it to this day because of course it never happened for me. And so I guess what I've learned as a result after the book happened, that many women in the State Department, and I haven't even talked about, the overt discrimination of bosses basically saying, you can't do political work, or, maybe you can, but a married woman couldn't, just to your face. It was really pretty appalling. But what I've learned since the book has been published is that so many of my female friends in the Foreign Service had the same experiences, the same sort of diminishment and worse, I should add, by their bosses and throughout their careers. And yet we never talked about it. We just didn't talk about these things back in the day. And so I actually think that it's probably good that I put it out there, because I think it is enabling some conversations, and it would have been a less lonely passage for me in the Foreign Service, as I nevertheless persisted and nevertheless was successful. But how much better would it have been if I had traveled that journey with colleagues who understood and were traveling that same journey with me? It would have been a lot more comforting.
Absolutely.
It's hard to trust people with very sensitive information, but maybe I should have given it a try.
Are there changes that you think still need to be made in the Foreign Service and in the State Department more broadly in this space?
I think there are, and I think there is a lot of work being done now to try to modernize and reform the State Department. I think what it needs is a big champion at the State Department, led, of course, by the Secretary of State. We all know that individual is kind of busy. So, there needs to be a big champion right underneath that person. And on the Hill, somebody who is ready to go, hand-to-hand combat for budgets and for the kind of reforms that we need at the State Department.
Mhm. What inspires you about some of the early career women and others joining the Foreign Service today that you meet?
Yeah. Well, I guess, their strength and their commitment. And, in this case, I wouldn't say that it's any different from, my male colleagues that, exhibit those same traits. And I'd also like to just add that even though I had male bosses and others who were at a minimum undermining me, I also had many male mentors and bosses who were boosting me and, helping me along the way. I mean, back in the day, in the 1990s, we didn't talk about mentorship the way we do now. And so, I didn't think of it in those terms, but that's what it was. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that, that I got a lot of support from my male colleagues too.
So zooming out a little bit, I want to invite you to share further observations about your work and work more broadly in U.S. diplomacy and foreign affairs. You've said since World War II that the single most important driver of American power and influence is the power of our ideas about democracy, about individual liberties, capitalism, and security. So given all of the challenges in our country today, whether it's extreme political polarization, weakened public trust in institutions and elections, rolling back of women's rights, and a lot more, do you think that's still true?
I do. I think that our values are the most important thing about the United States, and they infuse our economy and our security and our politics, or they should infuse our politics, I should say. And, there's that old saying that the United States is a shining city on the hill. And for many countries in the world, that is still true. When I think about the refugee flows and where people want to go, whether it is because they are in an insecure environment or because they are seeking better opportunities, economic opportunities, they're not rushing to China. They're not rushing to Russia or Saudi Arabia. They are coming to the United States because again, they feel that this is a country where not without challenges, that they could settle in and raise their children and get the opportunities that we have so long provided to the huddled masses. And when I talk to friends in Europe, friends in Ukraine, they still look to us for leadership. I think we can see that in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. It is the U.S. that is leading, along with allies and with partners. And we are leading well in a very, very challenging, perhaps the most challenging moment in my adult life. And I think countries want that leadership and look to that leadership for the U.S. And it's not because we have the biggest military, and it's not because we have, the largest economy, although both of those things reinforce the United States mightily, but it's because of what we represent. And I think that countries that have, countries hope that we will continue to steer that course according to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
To what extent do you think our ability as the U.S. to project power, and especially soft power, around the world, and I think that follows a bit from what you were just describing, has it been weakened? How has it been weakened by developments here at home? How does it look different?
Well, I think, so soft power, in other words, not, sending your military in to tell people what's what. Soft power comes from so many different sources, and it's not all official. In fact, most of it is not official. I mean, if you consider the power of American movies, American literature, American online sources, if you consider the power of Disney World and Disneyland, and the blue jeans industry, right? I mean, you can't be cool without having blue jeans. And I'm sure there are other products that I am not cool enough to know about that we are marketing all over the world. I mean, all of those are examples of soft power. And that continues and is important. I would say that, in 1991, first in 1989, when the wall fell, and then in 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, I think we all thought, this is great. Everybody's going to march into the future and be a democracy, and we're going to be prosperous, and there will be no more wars. And so we basically pulled our military out of Europe over time. The Europeans basically collapsed their militaries. We were looking for that peace dividend. And so we saw that very clearly on the military side. But it also happened in other ways. So earlier we were talking about exchanges, which, when we send students around the world in their high school and college years to be ambassadors of the United States, sharing our culture with people all over the world. And when people come to the United States and have an opportunity to see how different the US is from state to state, even from town to town, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. It doesn't mean they're going to agree with us on everything, but creating mutual understanding is the official term. And it's kind of sounds wonky, but it's really important for when 40 years later and one of those exchange students is opposite the negotiating table with you, and you're explaining why it's difficult to get this. I keep on going back to tariffs, but why it's difficult to get an economic agreement done because of a particular industry in a particular state. And that person understands, doesn't agree, but understands where we're coming from, and maybe can even provide a workaround that works for their country that, I or another diplomat wouldn't have necessarily thought about. And so I think the sort of the interaction between students, citizens, artists, teachers, whoever, business people, it pays dividends in all sorts of ways we never even know about. And I think that's crucially important. And, in the 1990s and the aughts, we started pulling back all those programs because we thought we didn't need it. And same thing with other Cold War instruments, shall we say, via the radios, as we call them, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. We really diminished those budgets as well. And I think now we're ramping up on all of that again, and we should be, because these are tools we need in good times and in bad. In bad, it's clear why we need them, but it's hard to ramp it up, right? Because there's a long lead time for that kind of soft power projection. And in the good times, we need to be preparing for bad times, right? And, people look at me and they say, oh, you're so idealistic. And it takes, 40 years to grow that politician, that leader. And we don't have that kind of time. And I'm thinking, about the F-35. I mean, we spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And I would say probably more than 40 years. Maybe it was 30 years. And somehow that's okay, because that is for our military. So why can't we spend a couple of $1 million with, maybe the goals aren't quite as concrete, it's a little fuzzier, it's harder to see. But I think over time, if you look at the success of those exchanges and where those individuals have ended up in various governments, it has paid us back mightily. And so I don't think I'm being idealistic. I think I'm being really practical and pragmatic.
Yes.
So it's we need to invest in foreign policy in order to get the kinds of results we want in our foreign policy.
And I think I love all of that and agree. I mean, we definitely need idealism, but, and I think what you're saying is so practical, and I think resonates so well in a university context, as we're thinking as well about how do we get people out around the world? How do we bring people here? How does education fit into diplomacy? you've noted that it's a long, hard road to establish the rule of law or democracy in a country where it does not exist. You talk a lot in the book about corruption, generally, and in the countries that you worked in. What convinced you in the statement that I shared about sort of issues of corruption, the challenges of building democracy in places where it just didn't exist before?
What convinced me?
Of what was the basis for the statement that it's a long, hard road to establish the rule of law or democracy in a country? What did you observe in those places that were working to build it? What was significant there? What was working?
So in 89 in what is now Central Europe was Eastern Europe, and then in 91 in the former Soviet Union, all of those countries came to us, not just the US, to France, Germany, the UK, and asked for help in managing their transitions from a communist command and control economy, a very ordered, not to say repressive system. And they asked for our help in those transitions to democracy and capitalism. And you can see, we don't have enough time to go country by country, but you can see that some countries were way more successful than others. I mean, I think about the Baltic countries, right? That had a very different history than Ukraine or Georgia or Russia. They had only been in the Soviet Union for whatever it was, 45 years, probably that's wrong, but a period of time where it was still within their DNA and their collective memories of what it was like to have a family farm, to own a factory, to make your own decisions on various things. And so I'm not saying it was easy for those countries, but it was easier because they had an idea. They also had very active diasporas that had been in Europe and in Canada, in the United States, that were mobilized and that were educated and ready to go back and help. And they really managed those transitions incredibly well. Not to say that they still don't have challenges of various kinds, but they managed them incredibly well. For countries like Russia and Ukraine that also asked for the same kind of assistance from the United States and others, it was harder because they were being governed by people, in no case did the country all of a sudden become ruled by a bunch of young Democrats, small d is what I meant by that. And in all cases, they were still ruled by the same person that had the top job. For example, in Ukraine, he was a member of the Politburo. He was the General Secretary of the Republic of Ukraine. And then he transitioned through elections. He transitioned to becoming the president of Ukraine. But, great guy in many ways, but he was, not somebody who understood, shall we say, what a democracy is, what capitalism is, what would need to happen, the nuts and bolts of what would need to happen to make that transition. Nor were, those around him particularly interested in following that path. The Soviet Union had been good to them, right? And, they more of the same would have been fine for many folks, not the people of Ukraine, but the leadership. And so, it was very challenging because while on the one hand there was a lot of talk, on the other hand there was very little walk in those early years, and so it just took a long time. And in the case of Ukraine, 2 revolutions, multiple elections, where the Ukrainian people kept on saying, really, really, this is how we want to live. We want to live according to Western values. We don't. We want to live in a place that where I can get a job and take care of my family, where my children have a good future, where they can have a good education, where I can go out on the street and I don't have to pay a bribe to the cop because he's not getting paid well enough and that's the way he makes his salary, and where I can hold my leaders accountable. I can vote for the guy I want to without interference, and if that guy isn't getting the job done, I can hold him accountable and vote him out of office. And most people in America and in Ukraine they phrase it that way. They don't talk about democracy or big political science terms. They talk about it in very practical terms. But the fact remains, at least in my opinion, that democracy and capitalism are flawed systems. I mean, we all know that, right? But they are the systems that have provided more of those kinds of elements to more people than any other systems. And so, you know, that to me is what the Ukrainian people have wanted, and they've said it over and over again. And so it's a process. I mean, change is always hard. I mean, we see that in the United States. I mean, anytime you say the word reform, there are going to be people opposed because, you know, it's their rice bowl. You know, they're getting something out of the existing system. So they're going to oppose the reform. Same thing is true in other countries as well.
So let's talk about 2019, when you were fired from your role as ambassador to Ukraine after a 33-year career in the State Department. Not just fired, of course, but subject to a highly targeted disinformation campaign that happened both in Ukraine and at the highest levels of the US government at that time. And you note in the book, I think, a compelling quote that this was something as new as it was threatening. Corrupt actors in Ukraine were colluding with the corrupt actors in the US, and they were successfully influencing our government and our people. It was a shock made all the more devastating by the fact that rather than stopping it, people close to the president of the US were aiding and abetting the effort. And when Trump waded into the fray by sharing the results of this disinformation campaign with his tens of millions of Twitter followers, he showed how effective the operation had been. Talk about the moment that it became clear to you that the State Department didn't have your back, and as it had for so many others in the Foreign Service in so many prior instances. You described it as devastating, as a stark departure from the unwavering support that the department usually provides to diplomats like you, as you have in such a personal way in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that moment and what you did next?
Yeah. So there were many moments because, you know, perhaps I still am idealistic. And so, you know, I kept on hoping that, you know, what I was seeing around me, and this was all happening around me. I mean, nobody was really, you know, calling me into their office and saying, this is happening. And much of it I found out after I'd been removed, when, you know, so many investigative journalists were on the case as to what happened and published their articles. And so I learned a lot more. But you know, as I was hearing that, you know, X person at the White House was asking how I was doing, which is unusual at that level, that they would be asking what, you know, a relatively obscure ambassador was doing. As I was hearing that, you know, private interests in the US wanted to get rid of me because they wanted to set up basically no tender sweetheart deals in the energy sector, various other things like that. You know, I would go back to the State Department, and this is Ukrainians telling me this. My colleagues, you know, in the Ukrainian cabinet, in the private sector and so forth. So, you know, I would talk to my team, are you hearing this? And nobody knew anything about this. And so then I would, you know, go back to Washington and say, just letting you know that this is out there. I mean, do you know anything about this? Am I being replaced? Because being replaced as ambassador is not unusual. It happens all the time. Presidents get to name ambassadors and they get to remove them. And there doesn't have to be any reason. You're just removed, and usually then a political ambassador is put in your place. And that is the president's right. But what was happening with me is there was this miasma out there of all these rumors that I was going to be replaced. And then there was this smear campaign that started, that I was corrupt, that I was pressuring the Ukrainian government to stop prosecuting corrupt individuals in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that I had embezzled money. I mean, this was wild. And it turned out that the individual who had given this interview to an American publication, and then it was published, that interview had been arranged by former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who, as we all know, is or was at the time the president's personal lawyer. So it was all very concerning and upsetting. And I went back to Washington. And when those articles came out, I basically said that, I needed a statement of support from the State Department, ideally from the Secretary of State Pompeo, and it needed to come out fast or I wouldn't be able to survive. And, so there was a lot of dithering around, and that statement of support never came. Instead, I was told by somebody fairly senior at the State Department that I should indicate my loyalty to President Trump. Now, all of you know that, Foreign Service officers, every public servant, I mean, we are absolutely loyal to our government, to the president's foreign policy. We implement the president's foreign policy and so forth. And all of us do swear an oath. We swear an oath to the Constitution. We don't, crucially, in the United States, we do not swear allegiance to an individual. We did that back when we were a colony of Great Britain, when we swore allegiance to the king. And one of the things the American Revolution was about was stopping that practice. And so, I mean, this was just incredible to me. And, in the end, I tried to sort of, I put out a statement. It ended up being about Ukrainian elections and the importance of the electoral process and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It obviously was not what I had been instructed to do, basically. Yeah, it was a terrible time.
I can't even imagine. I want to ask, I think, for so many of us, we have this visual of you that maybe we saw on our computer screens or in images in newspapers or on TV of you giving your testimony at the Intelligence Committee meeting in the Trump impeachment inquiry. What did you do to prepare for that moment, for that testimony? I know you shared a statement, but you were also questioned. How did you prepare for that moment based on the career that you had, the ways that you were trained, the experiences that you had? And what did you want to make sure that you conveyed, not only about working in the Foreign Service, but also about you and who you are?
Yeah. So, I felt that I was in the worst place imaginable for a public servant. I was being asked to testify by a Democratic Congress, as a fact witness, but nevertheless against a Republican president who was also my ultimate boss because I was still an employee. I was being, I was in the middle, not only between Republicans and Democrats, but between the executive branch and the legislative branch in advance of presidential elections. That is not a good place for a public servant to be. Really, it was not a good place. And so, very late in the process, actually, I was able to get some fabulous lawyers who basically, it felt like they saved my life. And they did it pro bono. I was very, very fortunate because I would have had $1 million legal fee if they hadn't done that. And so they kind of went through things with me. But before I even met with them, I did a timeline of, what I recalled. And I did a glossary of, people and phrases and everything else, because, many of these, the people that I was referring to or the acronyms that we would be using, I knew would be unfamiliar to the lawyers. So I prepared before I even went into the lawyers. They kind of walked me through everything. We did a little game playing of, what a potentially hostile situation could be like. And then I just tried to follow my father's advice, which is do the best you can, just do the best you can. I remember writing on my legal pad, the truth is on your side. And that was really helpful to me because people could say whatever they wanted. I knew what was true. And I was going to tell the truth, and I was going to deal with this process with as much integrity as possible. But what I wanted to do was also to share with, because there were many different audiences, right? I mean, there was the Democratic audience, there was the Republican audience, but there was also America. And I wanted to share, so I told the lawyers, and my lead lawyer was very opposed to this. I made a statement in the beginning that talked about, the oath of office and how important that was, and how Foreign Service officers uphold that every day to defend and support the Constitution, but also the American people. And then I sort of went through the timeline a little bit because in these hearings, if you don't get out your own truth up front without interruption, you may never get it out because there's a lot of grandstanding. I'm sure that's a shock to people, but there's some grandstanding involved. So I wanted to make sure that the facts as I knew them were going to get out. So there were two things. One was, this is the Foreign Service, and we are honorable people, because I saw this, and I think many in the Foreign Service saw this as an attack not only against me, but against the Foreign Service and the State Department as an institution. And, I mean, imagine you're doing hard things in your country. You are pushing people to in pursuit of American foreign policy. I was following our policy, and I was implementing it, and I was, of course, the lead person in the face of that. And that could be rough sometimes. And so I was pulled out essentially because I was following that policy, and it was inconvenient to corrupt actors in the United States and inconvenient to corrupt actors in Ukraine. So imagine this: you're an ambassador in another country, being asked to do hard things where there's opposition, both in the country and in the United States. There always is going to be, whatever the position is, there's going to be opposition in some quarters. So do you go in as hard as you would have otherwise? Or do you pull your punches because maybe the Secretary of State, maybe the president isn't going to support you, even though you are following American policy? So for me, and I think for many, I mean, it was my personal, tragedy, but it had far greater implications for our national security.
Absolutely. And thank you for that incredible service. And I think in that, I mean, in so many moments, but in that moment being an incredible inspiration. And I think, as we think about training future leaders here, I think we talk a lot about ethics and what does it mean to be a truly ethical leader. And I think you demonstrated that in so many ways. We should talk a little bit about Ukraine and what's happening in the world at this moment. I think changing, moment to moment. This is a question actually that was shared in advance with me from Julia Santucci, who's one of our senior lecturers at GISPIA. She asks, is a diplomatic solution possible in Ukraine? Why should we care about Ukraine? I think she notes that the US and its European allies have been steadfast in supporting Ukraine. I think that's clear to all of us, and in standing up to Putin through sanctions, which is one tool, of course, that we're using. Yet still, Russia's assault on Ukraine continues, and I think we've seen it amplified in the recent days. What more should we be doing, or could we be doing, to stop Putin, especially before he deploys even more dangerous, deadly options like chemical or biological or nuclear weapons?
So that's more than one question.
It was a combined question.
Yeah. So I mean,
part of it.
you've hit all all the really important issues. So the first one is a diplomatic solution possible now, I think you said. And right now, no, it's not. It would have been possible, I think, in the early days of the war. The Ukrainians were putting a lot on the table. They were putting, NATO membership, security guarantees, borders. There was a lot that they were willing to negotiate on. And the Russians were running out the clock and not ever serious about those negotiations. And then Bucha, first of all, the Ukrainians were able to pick off enough of that, 30-mile long convoy that we all saw, so that the Russians had to retreat, and Bucha was liberated. And when the Ukrainian people saw what had happened in Bucha, the rapes, the torture of civilians, the killings of civilians, it was like a switch was flipped, that this is not possible in this day and age, and we are going to fight to the end. We need to take President Putin seriously when he says things like Ukrainians are not a real people, they're not a distinct people, that Ukraine is not a country outside of the Russian, it is a part of the Russian Empire. And if we don't understand that, then we will be destroyed. And you saw what happened in Bucha, and you've seen what has happened in other towns and cities that have likewise been liberated by the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians said, basta, no more. And they have, you know, been fighting valiantly, and most recently have seen a lot of success. And so I think right now the Russians are unwilling to stop fighting because they are losing, and the Ukrainians are unwilling to stop fighting because they have not yet met their objectives. And they know that if they stop short of their objectives, Russia will just negotiate all of that away. They will be put under pressure by other countries, as happened in 2014, 2015. And they need they need to meet their military objectives, their national objectives, and then sit down at the negotiating table. So diplomacy will prevail in the end, but there is a time and a place for everything. And unfortunately, it is not yet now. Although we see I mean, important, but smaller examples of diplomacy that's worked. So the Turkish initiative to end the blockade of Odessa was hugely important and successful. A number of POW swaps, that was, you know, again, very, very important. But on the biggest issue, the time is not yet. And so, you know, what will it take for a diplomatic solution? What the Ukrainians want is the 1991 international borders. In other words, going back to the international borders that Russia has recognized repeatedly in various treaties and agreements. And in fact, I have met President Putin only once. And it was in 2001 when I first arrived in Ukraine at a diplomatic reception in honor of the 10th year anniversary of Ukrainian independence. He had flown down from Moscow to help the Ukrainian government celebrate Ukraine's independence. So, I mean, he personally has acknowledged Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity. The Ukrainians are pretty adamant about 1991 borders. They want security guarantees, you know, unclear exactly what that would be. They want reparations, preferably coming from Russia to rebuild the country. And they want accountability. They want justice for the people that have been killed in Bucha and elsewhere. I think that's tremendously important to bring justice to the Ukrainian people. But I think it's also important that war criminals be held accountable so that Russia never does this again, number one, because we've seen the pattern of Putin's rule, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, 2015, and again in 2022. He will keep on going if he gets away with it. And so I think there needs to be that kind of accountability so that Russia doesn't do it again, but also so that other dictators around the world understand that if they try to do something like this, the international community will stand up and speak for justice, and that they will not be able to get away with it, that there will be a price that is paid. So that's a very ambitious agenda, but I think it's an important one.
Absolutely.
So what were the other questions?
We might jump to some of the questions from the audience. We have 10 or 15 minutes left.
Oh,
I have to
actually, can I interrupt?
please,
because
of course.
I just remembered one of the other questions, which is why should we care about Ukraine?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important question. I mean, Ukraine is a country far, far away. And I bet that there are people in this room that probably couldn't find it on a map prior to February of 2022. And now we all know where it is. And why do we care? So we care because we see that that Russia is violating all of the is violating the principles of the international rules-based order that were established after World War II, that has kept more people more free, more prosperous, more secure since any time in human history. I'm not saying that the international order, as we call it, isn't flawed in some ways, doesn't need to be reformed, doesn't need to change. It should be, all of those things. But nevertheless, just destroying it leaves us all, including American citizens, in a much more precarious position. And Vladimir Putin, when he invaded Ukraine with no pretext, when he violated international borders, when he violated Ukrainian human rights, was destroying that international order. And he has made clear that, you know, this is Putin talking, when he is successful in Ukraine, when he has annexed all of Ukraine, he is going to keep on going. And so that would be a tragedy for Ukraine and Ukrainians. It would be, I think, make a mockery of the rules-based order. But it would also, and I think this is why we are so strong in support of Ukraine, it would also make us less free, less secure, and less prosperous. This is an assault on our national security, because if Putin creates the rules, if we live in a might makes right kind of a world where big countries get to do whatever the heck they want, including threatening nuclear warfare, we are all in a far more vulnerable state, and that is dangerous for all of us. Because if we, so what I would say is that it's the right thing to do to support Ukraine, but it's also the smart thing to do to stop Putin in Ukraine before he can keep on going. And just on the nuclear threat, which is so, I think, hard for each one of us, or at least speaking just for myself, it's an emotional thing. I mean, when somebody, a world leader of a powerful country casually sort of talks about nuclear warfare, that is frightening, I think, to all of us, and we react emotionally. But here's what I would say. I think that Ukraine has no choice. They have to keep on fighting, because if they don't, they will be destroyed. And we need to keep on supporting Ukraine, because if we give in to nuclear blackmail, it's not like it's going to end. Putin will have learned that lesson, and he will use it again. That doesn't make us more safe. And other countries will learn that lesson, and they too will use that threat. And perhaps even worse is that a third set of countries will seek to get the nuclear weapon, because they will want it for their own security, because they will feel it's the only way to guarantee their own sovereignty and independence, and they will want it so that they can threaten their neighbors. That is not a place that is good for the United States. So we don't really have a choice either. We need to keep on supporting Ukraine as strongly as possible, with security systems, with humanitarian assistance, and with economic support.
Thank you for that. One of the questions from the audience comes from Yvonne, and I'm sorry, I am unable to read the last name. It starts with a K, but a former Pitt employee. She's wondering about your thoughts on yesterday's strong UN resolution condemning Russia's annexation of parts of Ukraine. Do you see this as influencing Putin at all, for the better or for worse? And does this increase the chance of a peaceful resolution of this illegal breach of Ukraine's sovereignty?
So I think it's a symbolic step, and I think it was an important symbolic step because back in February, the UN General Assembly voted, and it was 141-4 to condemn Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Yesterday, we had another vote at the UNGA, and it was 143 countries, who condemned Russia's illegal referendum in 4 areas, and this called on Russia to roll it back and to live up to the principles of the UN Charter, the UN of which Russia is not only a member, but a really privileged member, because it is a member of the Security Council too. So do I think it's going to make a difference to Putin? Sadly, no, I don't think so. But I think it will make a difference. It is hugely symbolic. And the Russians were furiously working against this and tried everything, including, when they saw that they weren't able to stop the measure being voted on, they tried to get a procedural point in there that it would be a secret vote. So you can imagine that then, they would try to get countries on side with all sorts of little side deals and everything else. And even that failed. So I think it was very, very symbolic. And it showed the isolation that Russian actions are driving themselves toward. That is not a good place for a country that wants to be a superpower. And even China and India, which have expressed publicly twice now that the war is not good and no more on the nuclear threats, they did not vote for, but they abstained, and that was hugely important. And so I like to think that the increasing isolation that Russia is facing is going to sober up some people in Russia. I'm not sure it's going to have an effect on Vladimir Putin himself.
Since we're talking about international organizations, I think there are lots of questions, and I think especially early on about the role of the International Criminal Court or human rights declarations and any enforceability around human rights violations. Any thoughts on how that looks in the months and maybe even years to come as we sort of deal with hopefully what becomes an aftermath of this conflict?
Yeah. Well, I think the work is already starting. The Ukrainians are absolutely adamant, and they are putting resources against, investigating, every village and town that has been liberated, and investigating how people have died, and documenting if it was a crime and what kind of a crime and so forth. They have, tiger teams that are all over the country, and I think it's very difficult work. The U.S. is supporting this. I mean, we've seen, I think Merrick Garland himself, I think went to Kyiv to announce our cooperation with various assistants in this endeavor, and other countries are also helping. When I was in Kyiv about a month ago, the man who's in charge of all of this, what he said was that what they're hoping for is, it could move forward in various ways. But what he's hoping is a special international tribunal on Ukraine. The other thing I would caution is that, we react to, the news and the photos and the information of these terrible atrocities emotionally and viscerally, and we want justice now. And you can only imagine how the Ukrainians feel. But these are legal matters, and they take a lot of time, and a lot of it is, down to the specific definitions of specific things. And so it will take a long time, but the Ukrainians are hard at work not creating the evidence, but documenting the evidence now, so that they're ready when justice can be served.
Important and obviously hard work. We have 3 questions from the audience that I'm going to try to squeeze in the last moments that we have. One is from Ryan Grauer, who is one of our faculty members here. He teaches a course on civil and military relations at GISPIA. And one of the themes of the course is how difficult it is to clearly delineate between which jobs are civilian and which are military. And by virtue of its size, resources, global reach, the military engages what can often be thought of as traditional civilian diplomacy activities. How did you think about cooperation and coordination with Department of Defense and the broader reach that it has in your work? And did that change at all over the course of your career?
So obviously the Defense Department is an indispensable partner to the State Department on all things. And by and large, I had an excellent relationship with my colleagues at DoD, which isn't to say that we didn't have knockdown drag-out fights, both in Washington and when I was in embassies overseas. Obviously most particularly in my last three years in the Foreign Service, when I was in Ukraine, where there was a hot war in the middle of Europe, and we were supporting the Ukrainians through training and providing military assistance. That was a very intense relationship, not only with DoD, but with other agencies as well. And, we really were one team, one fight. It was, a really great, what we call country team, which is all the agencies working together that the ambassador leads. So what I would say that, about some of the functions that DoD is doing now that kind of seem like, really, is that a soldier's job? And I think that DoD and many of my colleagues at the Pentagon have the same question. But what's happened over time is that we have, the DoD has received the resources. DoD has resources, and a lot of that is off the books, where we have, special budgets just for a war, just for this. And, those budgets are enormous and all encompassing. And the State Department has been starved for funds for decades. I mean, this didn't just start in the last couple of years. It's been true for years. And so when the saying is, when you got the only tool you have is a hammer, that's the one you're going to use, right? I think that over time, over the decades, and especially the decades with the long wars, we've had the militarization of our foreign policy. So, I'll just give you an example. Armenia, where we did not have a strong mill-to-mill relationship, but we had generals flying in on their own, I don't want to say personal planes, but on Department of Defense airplanes that they had a right to, because they were, at that level. So they could, fly into the Caucasus and hit all of the Caucasus countries in 2 days because they had a plane at their disposal. And they would try to, depending on the country, they would try to come once a quarter, twice a quarter, whatever. And they had budgets that we didn't have. And so, the Assistant Secretary of State, who might be at that same level, doesn't have a plane at his or her disposal. It's a lot harder to make those weird connections. It takes days to get there and days out. And so I'm seeing some people are laughing. I mean, this is a sort of a silly example, but when you see people all the time, and that's the defense people, when you see where the budgets are, and what you're receiving from the United States and how it lines up, I think countries understand where the power is and where the interests are of the United States government. And I think that's something that we need to work really hard on to get a better balance.
We'll end with one more question rather than two, but and I think an opportunity for a positive note. So one, thank you so much for being here, from Kate Gruhl, who's one of our Master of Public and International Affairs students at GSPIA. Can you speak more about your approach to leadership, the practices and behaviors that you think make a good leader? Yeah,
so I think, so this kind of takes us back to the beginning. I think being authentic, being who you are as opposed to who you think you should be, is really important, because who you actually are is going to come out during the stressful moments. So you might as well just present yourself as you are. I mean, that doesn't mean that you get to throw things at people and scream at them, but you need to have some self-control. Maybe I should have started there, but be who you really are. And try to do the job in a way that is comfortable for you. And so what was comfortable for me was building teams. I saw myself as somebody that was working with the team that, in every embassy that I led, there were people from many different agencies, and they don't necessarily, some of them are more obscure agencies. This is not a true example, but for example, the post office people. I mean, everybody here wants to be able to, to send letters anywhere in the world that they want to, right? That's important. But is it the number one goal in the country that you're in? Probably not. So how do you get that person who's leading that agency in to buy off on, all of the other things that we're doing? How do I carve out the time to support that person on the important postal negotiations that are taking place? How do we work harmoniously together as a team? I mean, with some agencies, it's more natural, the big foreign policy agencies, it doesn't mean that it's all smooth, but it's more natural. But, trying to build that team, trying to share information, trying to get them to share goals and reinforce each other as well as me. And for me to reinforce them, I thought was hugely important. I think leading with integrity is really important. People who I mean, in Ukraine, when I was there, we had over 1,000 people at the embassy, Ukrainians and Americans, and they're watching everything that you do. And different people see, if, I don't know, if you're fiddling with the gifts or, with your expense account or whatever it might be, or if you're not really doing what you say you're doing. Those are small examples, but integrity, I think, is a muscle that needs to be constantly exercised. If you don't live, and I'm not saying that that we don't all make mistakes, including mistakes of integrity. But if you don't try hard to be ethical and to treat other people well and to do the right thing on the small things, you're not going to be able to do it on the big things. It is very rare, and I'll give you, sort of another example that is obvious. It's very rare that somebody is going to approach you out of the blue and say, here's a $10 million bribe for you to do the wrong thing. Most people would say no to that, because it's just so outrageous. But what happens is you're hooked in over time with smaller amounts of money. And then even if you want to stop, you can't, because whoever's paying you has the goods on you. And then you are in a world of hurt because you're doing things that are really bad for your country. So, leading with integrity, including on the small things, even when everybody else is rolling their eyebrows of, why are we doing that? Because that's the rule. We do this because that's the rule. And partly, so for those of you who are rules followers out there, you're going to like this. For those of you who don't love following the rules, you're going to roll your eyes. Rules are there to protect us, actually. So, we have rules in the US government that some of them are crazy, actually, about what we can and cannot accept in the form of gifts and gratuities and various other things. And so one example is that I was ambassador and I was leaving a country and I was offered, an upgrade to first class on this plane. And I said, no, I can't do it. I had tried and I had asked our administrative people and they said, no, that's against the rules. So I was sitting back in steerage. And so all of the business people who were, of course, in business class and first class, they would come back to steerage to have their private consultations with me in economy. But they all noted that I was sitting in economy. And when they had seen the steward say, wouldn't you like to sit here, Madam Ambassador? And I said, no, it's against our rules. They had noted that, and they would tell me that later with pride. And I think that's, I'm not trying to sort of burnish my own credentials here, but just to say that you want an ambassador that is following the rules, that is not taking, little gratuities here and there, and that I think creates a sense of pride and belief that you are going to do the right thing on the big issues, because that's what you want. Because in our business, there is not a clear path forward. I mean, by the time I got a problem set, it was hard. By the time it goes to the president, it's impossible. And so, you have all sorts of bad options and worse options. Which ones do you pick? And part of, picking the option, which we all hope is the right option, selling it to your team, selling it to the other countries, moving forward with confidence that this is the right way. Part of that is people believing that you are acting with integrity and the interests of the United States people in mind. So, I mean, those are a couple of things. I think there are just two other sort of characteristics that I think are important in leadership and just for everybody. One is to be optimistic, that you can believe it. So this is another Colin Powell saying, which is optimism is a force multiplier. I mean, if you go in with a hangdog expression and say, we have to do this, it's never going to work. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. But if you go in and say, so here's the solution, here's the problem, here's the solution. It's going to be challenging, but I know this team can do it. And how are we going to do it? Come on, team, what are the ideas? You have a fighting chance that it might actually happen. So I think optimism is important and persistence is important, because often we're working problem sets for years. And so you're just sowing the seeds, like George Shultz said, so that another team later on can reap the rewards of a peace treaty or whatever it might be. But it takes time often for diplomatic solutions, for any kind of a solution. And so you have to be willing to put in the time and keep at it until finally all of the stars are in alignment, good leaders in both countries, people willing to take political risk, the outlines of a solution, and you move forward.
That's a perfect way to end. Absolutely.
Moving forward.
Moving forward, hopeful, and I think what we all can do in our lives and in our work. So I started out by thanking you for your incredible work in public service and the ways that you've served all of us. And I'll close that way as well. Your career is absolutely an inspiration for me, for so many in this room, and much more broadly. And I think what you demonstrated, especially in a truly extraordinary and challenging moment in diplomatic and in US history, I think you gave us all a lot to aspire to. And on behalf of the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, thank you so much for being here and for connecting with us, Ambassador Yovanovitch.
Thank you.
We
It was an
appreciate it.
honor. It was really an honor to be here.